Hi everyone, and welcome to another video. I hope your 2024 is starting off well. Before I get started with this video, I want to mention that I'm having a brief sale on my orchestration course, which is still in early access. Starting today, the Fundamentals of Orchestration course is 45% off until this Sunday, January 14th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can use the code NEWYEAR2024 at checkout to get the discount. More information in the description box below. And while the course is still in progress, anyone who purchases the course right now gets the remaining chapters for free when they're released. I recently finished Chapter 5, and so I'm currently working on Chapter 6, which is all about orchestrating for woodwinds. This brings us to today's video. I wanted to make a video that went into the same amount of detail as my course, so I decided to analyze and discuss a movement from Maurice Ravel's Mother Goose Suite, specifically the third movement of that suite. Ravel originally composed this suite for piano four hands in 1910, and it was written specifically for children to perform, so unlike a lot of Ravel's piano music, it's not so virtuosic in nature. In 1911, Ravel then orchestrated this suite, so in this video I'll start by looking at the piano four hands composition, then I'll switch to discussing the orchestration, and then at the end, I'll discuss my mock-up of this orchestration, which features mostly VSL sample libraries. Let's begin with the analysis of the composition. And like I said, we'll be looking only at the third movement, although I certainly recommend studying all five movements. The entire movement is 196 measures in total, which you can see here. I've reduced the 4 staves of the piano duet down to 2 to 3 staves for this analysis. I won't discuss how Ravel composed for piano duets specifically as a genre. I'm more interested in the notes, rhythms, harmonies, and structures for this video. The overall structure is a simple ABA form with the first A highlighted here in light blue. It lasts 64 measures, and the final climactic note of this section immediately kicks off the B section in measure 65, which goes all the way to measure 153. Now, the one wrinkle to this form, however, is that Ravel begins the A material towards the end of the B section, and there's about 15 measures where the end of the B overlaps with the beginning of A. It's actually a really neat compositional structure. He composed material that was contrasting enough to be placed in different parts of the piece, and yet they work really well when layered together. We'll explore later in this video how this layering changes the sound of some of the A material in an interesting way. At measure 153, the B material ends, and we get an almost identical repetition of measures 24 through 64 from the A section, with just a slightly different final few bars. Let's take a closer look at the A section. The A section is made up of several short motivic fragments, many of which imply or outline harmonic content. The piece is in F-sharp major, which can be tough visually in the score, but it's actually quite easy to play on piano. A large portion of this section features just the black notes of the piano, which creates a pentatonic harmonic palette. There's quite a bit of pentatonicism throughout, but also some whole tone and some extended tertian harmony as well. Before diving into these individual motivic fragments, one of the things to pay attention to throughout this analysis is how Ravel plays with rhythm and phrase structure. Throughout this piece, he rarely gives us symmetrical and evenly paced phrase lengths. And I think this really goes a long way into the playful yet unpredictable pacing and flow of the music. In this introductory 8 measures, Ravel creates metric ambiguity by beginning the gesture on beat 2 of the measure instead of beat 1. In doing so, the entrance of the melodic motive in measure 9 almost feels like it enters on an offbeat. It sort of confuses our sense of meter, but in a good way, and that's one way to effectively layer a foreground melody over a fragmented background layer. The first 23 measures can be grouped together as the first subsection of A, and this subsection features a long melodic line and several variations of an accompanimental gesture shown here. The first one on the left is the one that begins the piece, although I've notated it starting on the downbeat to show that it's a 2-measure or 4-quarter note long gesture. It's a simple ascending gesture that establishes the pentatonic harmonic environment at the beginning of the piece. The next fragment that I've outlined is basically an accelerated version of the first one. Instead of 4 beats in total, the pattern is now 3 beats, and so it sounds as though we're increasing the motion and activity. And like I said earlier, with a 3-beat pattern over a 2/4 time signature, Ravel can create an interesting sense of meter with this gesture looping underneath the foreground. The next highlighted gesture is just 1 measure or 2 beats in total, and it loops several times. This gesture begins with a C sharp to B natural interval, which is a minor 7th, and more importantly, because Ravel has established F sharp as the tonal center, we hear this C sharp to B natural as having a dominant function. He doesn't fully spell out a perfect dominant C sharp 7 chord, because that's not the harmonic language he's using. You might consider this collection of pitches, the C sharp, the B, the G sharp, the F sharp, and D sharp, as Ravel's version of a dominant chord. In a way, that F sharp is like a suspended fourth, but really there's a lot of ways to analyze this harmony. Hearing it as an extended tertian chord built from the dominant is certainly an option. Regardless of how you look at it or hear it, I think it certainly feels like a new chord area, as does this next gesture, which is the same thing transposed down a fourth, giving this moment almost a sense of a predominant harmonic function, which, as we'll see in a few moments, leads us into the next section that begins in C sharp. Looking closer at the melodic foreground, we see that it's entirely constructed from the F sharp major pentatonic scale without any non-chord tones. As you could hear, Ravel varies the phrase lengths slightly over the course of this melody, so once again he's working against symmetry to create something with a lot of playful motion and energy. The melody begins with a 3-beat pattern, then a 2.5-beat unit, then another 3-beat unit, and then several 2-beat units. Let's listen once more to hear the effect that this has on the texture. The melody continues on for 15 measures in total, and even when the quote-unquote root notes of the harmony change, the same pentatonic collection is heard in this foreground melody. Here's how these first 23 measures sound. As I said, the predominant harmony in the last few measures, if you want to call it that, leads us into the next subsection. This moment features an interruption gesture with a suddenly forte dynamic, a burst of energy in the upper register through the grace notes, and a C sharp and G sharp open fifth at the bottom. That's immediately followed by a transposition of that fifth down a major second, and a very high, very soft, fluttering gesture in pulsating 16th notes above. I view this entire 8-measure subsection as being a disruption gesture, one that interrupts the nice flow that Ravel had going in the first subsection. I find that sometimes as a composer, when you're writing music that has an inherent forward momentum and one that isn't strictly based on classical phrase structure, but instead from looping patterns and layers, you sometimes need some sudden bold gesture like this one in order to move on to something else. So that's what's happening here, and it also functions as a transition into the next section. The entire A section is full of these short motivic fragments, one after the other. Here we have a 3-measure motivic idea that repeats. You can see that the E natural and B natural in the lower staff indicates a shift further away from that original F sharp pentatonic collection. Even though this upper staff melodic gesture is still pentatonic, now that pentatonic idea is layered over extended tertian harmonic content with a strong sense of tonal harmony. This C sharp in the lowest voice is essentially becoming a dominant pedal tone that Ravel will eventually resolve back to F sharp. But before he does, we have this 4-measure phrase which I've labeled here E. Once again, the melodic material is entirely pentatonic, but the lower staff shifts up and down chromatically, alternating between F-sharp diatonic and a whole tone collection. By alternating those two harmonic collections, Ravel is increasing the intensity of the moment and maintaining the tension by delaying the resolution back to F-sharp. The melodic fragment continues and repeats all the way to the end of measure 55, and this subsection ends with a final C-sharp dominant chord here. This dominant chord finally leads us back to F-sharp, which features this motivic idea that I've labeled F. We finally get a real clear F-sharp in the lowest voice of the texture, and the F-sharp and C-sharp open fifth moves down to an E and B fifth, then back up. It calls back to that interruption gesture from before, but is now solidly in the tonic key area. And the melodic material in the upper register also sort of calls back to the opening material, but is a little less lyrical, almost more mechanical sounding. Let's hear the entire A section of this piano duet. Like the A section, the B section is made up of several motivic and harmonic ideas. However, there is one main B theme that can be found throughout. The full statement of this theme is here, but it appears many times in this section, including a fragmented statement at the very beginning of the section. Underneath this theme, the harmony is fairly static with a repeating low D sharp and A sharp pulsating ostinato. And because of this static harmony, it allows Ravel to layer the theme in a canon-like texture in measure 89. While much of the B section is harmonically static and simple, I want to take a closer look at these 14 measures. So the lower staff is constructed from a pedal A sharp in the lowest voice and major and minor triads in the middle register. These triads move chromatically up and down, similarly to an impressionist planing effect, although the chord quality isn't constant. I could probably make a separate video about this type of harmonic progression, but for now, let's just hear it in the piano reduction. Pay attention to how the middle register chords interact with the melody above and with the pedal A sharp below. So earlier I mentioned that the main wrinkle in this ABA structure was that Ravel brings in the A material before the B section ends. Instead of clear section divisions, he starts the A material here, while the lower staves repeat the static minor sonorities from earlier in the B section. This allows the A material, which was entirely in an F-sharp major pentatonic scale, to be reheard now in D-sharp minor pentatonic. This is a really cool moment in the composition, and anytime that you can bring something back that's familiar into a new harmonic context, you can potentially create these really special moments in the music. The end of the B section is disrupted by the same interruption motive from earlier in the first A section. After that, the rest of the A section repeats almost exactly until the last few measures, which add a final exclamation of the F-sharp pentatonic collection with these rapid arpeggios. Okay, let's give the entire piano duet a listen. Moving on to part 2 of this video, an analysis of Ravel's orchestration. His orchestrations are often extremely complex, and while this movement is certainly full of incredible detail, it's more accessible from an orchestration standpoint, in part because the piece was originally written for children to play on piano. The simpler composition leads to a slightly simpler orchestration. His instrumentation is on the smaller side with a small woodwind section, and the only brass instruments are 2 solo horns. There's a variety of percussion instruments, harp, celeste, and the string section. All of the audio examples from now on that I'll play will be from my Mockup, which mostly features VSL instruments. Here are the first 31 measures, the introductory subsection plus that interruption gesture. We'll start with this rhythmic pentatonic accompanimental pattern. Ravel divides the ascending gesture between a solo bassoon and a solo muted horn. He then adds in a solo flute to join in the 6th measure. Ravel loves to orchestrate with composite textures, meaning instead of copying and pasting a part from the piano duet into the orchestral score, he lets multiple parts that are slightly different from each other combine to form a composite texture. It's a common impressionist orchestration technique from the late 19th century, early 20th century, and in this case he adds harp and celeste, with harp alternating between normal plucked notes and harmonics. He also adds strings divided between muted pizzicatos, which double the wind parts, and muted saltasto trills, which add a shimmer to the background. All but double basses are playing divisi parts here. Ravel assigns the melodic foreground to a solo piccolo, and when the line eventually descends, the solo flute takes over. Piccolo has a really bright timbre, and even at pianissimo dynamics, it can carry this melody over the soft accompaniment. Let's hear the first 23 measures. Moving on to what I call the interruption gesture, I'll break this part down by instrumental section, starting with the woodwinds. Ravel gives the grace note gestures to piccolo, flute, and both clarinets, while the oboe and English horn have just the 8th note staccatos in that register, not the grace notes. In the next measure, piccolo and flute have the 16th note measured tremolo texture from the highest register material in the piano duet. Bassoons and horns are playing the lower material together, although in a slight composite texture, with bassoons on staccato 8ths and horns sustaining. Violins and violas are still divided here, with both violin sections alternating between pizzicato and bowed trills. The pizzicato notes accent the syncopated 8th notes in upper winds, while the bowed trills create a composite texture with those flute and piccolo 16th notes every other measure. In the lower strings, Ravel has the cellos and violas playing constant 8th note pizzicatos that double the horn and bassoon layer in a composite texture. In the percussion section, Ravel uses a crash cymbal to add some intensity to the syncopated 8th notes, and a glockenspiel that doubles the grace note upper winds part, and also a celeste doubling the 16th note measured tremolos from every other measure. The full orchestration of this moment features a lot of composite textures between instruments, with many individual instruments switching roles or articulations throughout. Moving on to the middle of the A section, Ravel places the initial foreground melodic material in a solo oboe, with English horn covering additional notes where necessary. He also has low xylophone adding punctuation to the accented oboe notes. In the lower staff, Ravel has pizzicato cellos and stopped horn playing a composite texture on the lowest voice, the C sharp that moves to G sharp and back. He has the cellos divided here, which allows half of them at a time to take off their mutes. Above them, the triad notes are divided between violins 1, 2, and violas, all of them now unmuted. In the next section, the top staff alternates between solo flute and solo English horn. Instead of giving this line to a single instrument or instrumental section, this switching back and forth is a really easy way to create timbral motion and intrigue in your orchestration. The lower two staves of this piano score are a bit more complicated here, with a lot of different moving parts and instruments contributing. For instance, look at the lower staff moving eighth note part. Just as Ravel moved the foreground back and forth between flute and English horn, he's moving this eighth note line between pizzicato violas and pizzicato cellos, while the second bassoonist has the full line intact. Likewise, the middle staff material moves between string sections, and the clarinet's first bassoon and harp harmonics shifts to muted horns and celeste. This is a common orchestration occurrence in Ravel's music, so even when the music is somewhat static or very repetitive, the orchestration is seemingly always in motion. The accompanying texture underneath the flute and English horn parts shifts once again, moving now entirely to strings, with harp and celeste added to the final measure. The celeste plus glissando strings in this measure create a really interesting composite texture and moment. Let's hear the entire middle portion of section A. Okay, on to the last portion of section A, the climactic moment of the first half of the piece. The top staff material is placed in flutes and xylophone initially, and joined by the other remaining upper woodwinds and celeste towards the end. The lower staff material is mostly in pizzicato strings, first violins, then violas join, and finally cellos and basses join in the last few measures. Ravel adds a few more colors throughout, some accented sustains and clarinets, oboes, bassoons, horns, and harp, which all add color and punctuation, and continuously create this sense of orchestral motion and energy. Here's how this section sounds put together. Okay, next we have the start of the B section. This section begins with a forte statement of the B theme, and Ravel uses an interesting combination of instruments in unison here. Perhaps not a combination that you would expect, and the horns certainly dominate initially. Ravel then removes instruments from that unison line a few at a time, however, as the line decrescendos to pianissimo. Listen for this timbral change happening throughout the line. You'll even be able to hear the low flute timbre at the very end. There's also several tam-tam notes in between phrases that really give this moment some character. In the next part of the B section, we finally reach a much calmer part of the music, and the orchestration relaxes a bit. In other words, it's not constantly changing and evolving. A solo clarinet takes the melody, and low strings have background minor triad sustains. The D-sharp, A-sharp pulse from the piano score is realized here in harp and half-section double bass pizzicatos. And later, celeste enters on the canon-like statement of the theme that is rhythmically offset from the clarinet. In the middle part of section B, we get this really harmonically complex moment with the shifting major and minor triads underneath the second half of the B theme. Like the previous section, there's a nice calmness about the music and orchestration here. The melody is placed in solo flute, with violins and violas playing the middle register triads, cellos and basses underneath, and harp adding the quarter note pulse. Ravel brings in clarinets and bassoons to highlight the accented background chords on occasion. Moving on to the final part of the B section, this is where Ravel brings back some of the A section overlapping with the end of B. Looking at the full score, we can see the B theme melody in clarinets is now joined by violas. That melody is fragmented and eventually passed to English horn and second violins, then to oboe and first violins. The background sustains that were earlier in strings are now expanded. We have low piccolo, low flute, low bassoons, muted horns, and low strings. Now there's a new layer, the material from the beginning of the A section, that's reimagined for this moment in celeste, harp, and soltasto muted strings that are playing measured finger trills. They're joined eventually by piccolo, then solo flute. In the background of all of this, there are some additional instruments contributing to the rhythmic pulse. Some pizzicato basses, cellos, and a timpani is heard for the first time, and some other percussion sounds as well. Here's how it sounds. Alright, the end of the B section leads directly into the interruption gesture and the rest of section A. The orchestration is essentially the same in this repeated A section as it was in the first A, so let's go back to the beginning and listen to the full movement. I'll switch over to the DA for this. Okay, so I'll end this video with a brief discussion on my mockup and the process for making this mockup. I started by making the Dorico score, so I manually inputted the entire movement into Dorico and then exported the MIDI file from Dorico, imported into Cubase. I then deleted all the extraneous CC data, leaving only the notes and velocities. I don't really do a whole lot of mixing after the fact, so to balance these instruments, I really pay careful attention to CC1 and CC11. CC1 mostly for dynamics, and CC11 for balancing instruments, which is especially necessary when you have things like string DVC parts. VSL doesn't have a Synchron library with DVC patches yet, so my best option is to lower CC11. Expression volume is also very useful when you have to balance instruments from different sample developers. Most of these instruments were recorded in Synchron Stage, but I had to add a few other sample libraries, which I'll discuss in just a bit. Starting with VWinds, most of these are from Synchron Winds. I start with one of their mixer presets from the full version of the library, so I have access to additional mic positions. Then for all of these, I've deactivated their internal reverb aux track, so instead I'm using two different external reverbs, both from cinematic rooms, a short tail and a long tail. You can see here in the piccolo track that I'm doing very little with the CC data. That's not always true for certain instruments and textures. There will be a lot more CC curves, but I tend to be a minimalist when it comes to mocking up orchestral works. For some of these tracks, piccolo included, I'm using expression maps, which you see here, to switch between different articulations. Other times, I don't use expression maps. I find that just using key switches is easier. The only non-VSL woodwind library that I'm using is this A Clarinet, and that's because VSL doesn't have an A Clarinet as far as I know. Normally it wouldn't matter, I just use B-flat clarinet. But in this piece, Ravel's A Clarinet solo moment features the lowest note, which isn't available on B-flat clarinet. I suppose I could do some transposition trick or something, but I chose instead to use my acoustic samples VWinds A Clarinet, which is really expressive. I'm using a combination of Berlin Studio reverb on this track and the main reverbs that the other instruments are being sent to. Here's how it sounds without any plugins. And with all of the plugins enabled. For brass, I'm using a combination of libraries. For the horn parts with straight mutes, I'm using Synchronized Dimension Brass con Sordino. For stopped horns, I couldn't find a VSL stopped horn patch, so I'm using Berlin Brass Mutes library, which for some reason has stopped horn but not muted horns, which has always confused me. For the moments that required unmuted, unstopped horns, I'm using Synchron Brass. Now, all of my percussion parts are with Synchron Percussion libraries, including timpani with soft mallets, crash cymbal, tam-tam, which I'm actually using this flat 70 centimeter instrument just because I thought the timbre worked best. And of course the mallet percussion instruments. I think for all of them, I started with a mixer preset and then adjusted the mic settings to get a sound that I liked. For strings, I'm using almost exclusively the Synchron Duality strings, all three versions in fact, the regular, the muted, and the new colors library. Something that I really appreciate is that VSL allows you to load up one instance of Synchron Player with all three versions of Duality strings accessible through a key switch, so that's what I've done. There are a few moments in this score that require muted saltasto trills. Unfortunately, the library does one or the other, not both together. But for those moments, I simply used the flautando patches. The only non-duality string moment is the opening double bass harmonics, which I'm just grabbing from Synchron Strings Pro. In terms of mixing, like I said, 99% of my mixing comes while I input CC data to each MIDI track. But of course, after everything is done, I go back and make adjustments, and I'm using then a few plugins on the individual section buses, some light EQing, and a few waves plugins. And on the master bus, I've got this True Iron Dynamics plugin, which I like, as well as some more EQ and a limiter, and that's it. During the mix process, I sometimes check my work with this tonal balance control plugin just to see if there's anything in the mix that's potentially problematic. But really, like I said, I'm trying not to do too much or use too many plugins since this is classical music. So that's it for this one. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. This Cubase file, along with the Dorico file, MIDI file, and Music XML file are all available on my Patreon page. And remember to grab my orchestration course this weekend at 45% off until Sunday night. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.